Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Hoarding, What Everyone Needs to Know by Gail Steckity and Christina Bratiotis, narrated by Laquita James. Publisher's Note: in this audio edition, you will hear references to figures and tables present in the print and ebook formats of the book. Introduction. In 2013, the American Psychiatric Association determined that hoarding disorder, HD, is a diagnosable mental health condition. This disorder has been studied only in the past 3 decades, although information about this surprisingly common problem has been accumulating at a great rate in recent years. In fact, published papers about hoarding have increased from 3 during the first half of the 1990s to 319 in the first half of the current decade, 2010 through 2015. This increased rate of published research on hoarding has continued in the past few years. In Dr. Randy Frost and Dr. Tamara Hartle's seminal 1996 paper on the compulsive hoarding syndrome, the authors proposed an explanation as to why people hoarded objects in their homes. Remarkably, the information they provided and their explanations stand up well today, even after scores of studies have been conducted on the psychopathology and treatment of hoarding. No doubt this information will continue to be updated in the coming years, but it provides a sound basis for understanding this complex and very serious condition. HD is defined as excessive saving of objects and difficulty parting with them to a point that the clutter in the home interferes with the person's or family's ability to use the rooms and furnishings for their intended purpose. Excessive acquiring is very common, even when the home has little or no space to accommodate new possessions. Lack of skills to organize and store objects contributes to the disorganized clutter, sometimes to the point that only narrow paths traverse the cluttered rooms. This can be especially dangerous for older adults with mobility problems, and sometimes results in structural problems and fires that can be deadly for victims in hoarded homes. Even when not physically dangerous, hoarding behavior impairs functioning in many different ways, including inability to find important papers or items, excessive spending and debt, family conflict, legal and housing problems, and in severe cases, homelessness. Several studies across the United States and Europe suggest that clinically significant hoarding behavior occurs in 1% to 6% of the population, with a likely overall prevalence among adults of about 2.5%. This means that 1 in every 40 adults suffers from problematic hoarding, with an even higher frequency among older adults. This remarkably high prevalence rate raises the question of why HD is so common, and whether Western consumerism and marketing might play a role in excessive accumulation of objects and difficulty parting with them. While there is limited information about why hoarding develops, it is a very serious problem that crosses cultures and socioeconomic groups and apparently spans the globe. Why do people hoard, even when they suffer such serious consequences? One reason may be lack of insight into or awareness of their illness. Limited insight is common among those diagnosed with obsessive-compulsive spectrum disorders, OCSD, among which HD is included. Unfortunately, most people who are afflicted remain convinced of the importance and need for their objects, even when others around them disagree completely, and there is compelling evidence that their acquiring, saving, and clutter are affecting their lives in a very negative way. Navigating sufferers' strong convictions about the importance of their possessions is especially challenging for mental health and other service professionals who are trying to encourage their clients to control the hoarding behavior. The reasons that people who hoard, acquire, and save objects are actually the same reasons that most people do, but they are taken to an extreme in the case of hoarding. For example, Common sentimental attachment to objects can become a strong emotional identification to broken or seemingly irrelevant items. Getting rid of this badly scratched saucepan would mean I'm not a good cook. I can't really read this receipt, but it represents a day in my life. In some cases, sentimental attachment involves anthropomorphism, as the person ascribes emotional feelings to objects. This stuffed bunny is dirty and torn, but it will be upset if I get rid of it. Other reasons for saving include aesthetic attraction to the beauty of the objects. I love everything purple. If it's purple, I have to save it. Another motivation for acquiring and saving is the conviction that the object could be useful one day. I collect broken furniture from the trash. Someday I'll have the time to repair this and make it useful again. Efforts to understand hoarding have led to useful theories that aid in developing treatments to address possible causes of hoarding symptoms. Among the ideas proposed is a cognitive behavioral theory that focuses on how people think and behave, and how these thoughts and behaviors influence their feelings. This kind of theory has been widely adopted and has led to hoarding-specific treatment programs. This treatment has been tested in individual and group formats, as well as in other delivery methods such as self-help books, peer support workshops, and computer/internet-based treatment in the home. This treatment includes strategies to enhance motivation and training in specific skills to aid thought processing that facilitates categorizing, sorting, and organizing jumbled piles of clutter. Other elements are practicing making decisions about whether to keep possessions in light of personal goals and taking action steps to remove unwanted items. This treatment has shown good success, but researchers agree that there is definitely room for improvement. Other theories for understanding hoarding behavior that derive from hoarding by animals and from the principles of economics might be helpful in expanding our understanding and treatment of hoarding symptoms. In addition, as the impact of hoarding on communities is better understood, community-based interventions are also being developed and studied. Many communities have developed hoarding task forces that include providers of social services such as housing, public health, child and adult protection, animal protection, legal and court assistance, and other services. These service providers work together to develop guidelines and methods for referring individual cases and providing access to interventions and treatments that meet clients' needs. Research on these community and housing interventions is in the early stages and shows good promise for successful outcomes. Many questions remain about what causes hoarding behavior and how to treat it. Hoarding runs in families, and there is no doubt that genetic factors play a role. But what aspects of hoarding are inherited and how? We know that many people who hoard have experienced some traumatic life events. But to what extent are these traumatic experiences important in the development of HD? We suspect that interruptions in early emotional attachments to parental figures may be a factor in the development of hoarding. But little is known about how attachments to people affect attachment to objects. Cognitive processes are presumed to play important roles in the inability to sort and organize objects, as well as other aspects of acquiring and saving behavior. But researchers are still working to understand which aspects of the brain and its functioning are involved and how. How to maximize treatment benefits while controlling costs remains a special challenge for HD clients with limited insight and motivation, and for communities with limited resources. These are only a few of the issues that challenge mental health professionals and others who are struggling to understand and treat this problem. Hoarding What Everyone Needs to Know aims to educate consumers, professionals, and the public about this complex problem, how it works, and what is known so far about how to treat it. Dr. Gail Steketee has conducted many studies on the nature and treatment of HD. She is a primary developer of the behavioral and cognitive therapy methods for this problem in conjunction with her close colleague, Dr. Randy Frost. Dr. Christina Bratiotis treats and studies hoarding disorder in the United States and Canada through the lens of social service providers and community task forces. She brings a broad professional, community, public, and family perspective to this book. Chapter 1 describes the various symptoms of hoarding and the criteria for defining HD as a psychiatric diagnosis. HD's common features are described in Chapter 2, followed by a separate chapter on neurological brain features of this complex condition. Chapter 4 focuses on the adverse impact of the problem on sufferers and others. Chapter 5 describes ways to assess the severity and associated features of hoarding, while Chapter 6 attempts to explain why hoarding happens, at least to the extent that we understand it at this time. In Chapter 7, we examine various treatments for HD, including medications and especially cognitive and behavioral methods. Chapter 8 examines self-help and family efforts to reduce excessive saving and clutter. In Chapter 9, we turn to community-based efforts to resolve complex and severe hoarding problems that affect those living in the home, neighbors, and others. In Chapter 9, we turn to community-based efforts to resolve complex and severe hoarding problems that can affect those living in the home, neighbors, and others. Finally, Chapter 10 raises questions that are not yet resolved in understanding and treating HD. Additional information about hoarding can be found among the several resources listed in the back of this volume. These include books for professionals, for the public, and for those seeking self-help strategies, as well as professional journals that carry articles on hoarding and HD. We also list websites with useful information and a few web applications that may be helpful to people who suffer from hoarding. We hope this book enables the many people who encounter hoarding to understand the problem better and to feel empowered to provide help and recommendations for those in need. Chapter 1. What is hoarding and hoarding disorder? How is hoarding defined? In a seminal article published in 1996, Drs. Randy Frost and Tamara Hartle described a syndrome they called compulsive hoarding. They identified three main elements of this condition. 1. Excessive acquiring and failure to discard a large number of possessions, often items that appear to be useless or of little value. 2. Cluttered living spaces that could not be used for ordinary daily activities. And 3. Significant distress or impairment in functioning because of the hoarding. The primary feature of hoarding is difficulty letting go of possessions that most people would not choose to keep, and that the person does not need, use, and sometimes even want. The kinds of items people who hoard save are not very different from what most of us have in our homes: clothing, shoes, magazines, newspapers, books, papers, pens, and pencils, electronic items like CDs and videotapes, containers, kitchen utensils and cooking equipment, toys, and decorative items. In rare cases, a person may save unusual things like used tissues, their own urine or feces, and even old food and food wrappers. This type of saving can lead to unsanitary conditions in the home. People with hoarding problems save objects for almost exactly the same reasons that most people do. For sentimental reasons, because they are useful, and because they seem beautiful. Chapter 2 provides more information about these reasons for saving. Excessive acquisition. Excessive acquisition is a problem for the vast majority of people who hoard. Upwards of 80 to 90% of those who have lots of clutter actively acquire additional objects currently or have done so in the past. They accumulate by collecting free things and buying items. often at low prices at garage sales, used clothing and furniture shops, and discount stores. Some people roam their neighborhoods on trash collection day to pick up items they want. Once a person has a reputation for collecting things, friends and relatives may give them things they don't want, things the person with hoarding problems feels obliged to keep. Occasionally, acquisition occurs through stealing, but this is rare. Excessive saving. Excessive saving refers to the inability of people who hoard to part with their possessions. Once they acquire an item and it becomes an owned possession, they are reluctant to let it go. Discarding items into the trash seems especially hard for most people who hoard. Harder than recycling them or giving them away. Perhaps because of feelings of guilt about waste and concerns that the objects have meaning and value and shouldn't just be tossed into the trash. Unfortunately, such sentiments lead to saving items that most people would not keep in their homes. Excessive clutter. Excessive clutter is the byproduct of acquiring and saving too many things that eventually fill up the household living areas and interfere with their normal use. Clutter is a defining feature of hoarding, but keep in mind that it is the consequence of excessive acquisition, saving, and disorganization, rather than the cause of the problem. A hoarding problem significant enough to be diagnosed as a disorder requires the presence of at least a moderate level of clutter in the home. In moderate cases, furniture and floors are typically covered with piles of disorganized objects, but some parts of the room are still usable. That is, people can walk through the room and sit down, even if they have to pick up a pile to do so. In extreme cases, the person who hoards and other household members cannot cook in the kitchen, sit in the living room, or even use the bathroom because of the interference caused by too much stuff. Disorganization. Most hoarded homes are disorganized to a point where similar items are not deliberately stored together and therefore can't be found easily. This means that important papers like car titles, insurance, and bills are mixed in among old magazines and other unrelated papers and objects. One woman described in the book Stuff found an envelope with $100 in it when she shook out an old newspaper because she had not separated the important and unimportant papers in her home. This difficulty organizing items seems to stem from problems with categorizing objects, paying attention, and making decisions, problems that are common among people who hoard. What are the criteria for diagnosing hoarding disorder? In 2013, the American Psychiatric Association recognized hoarding as a unique disorder in the 5th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM-5. The DSM-5 categorizes hoarding as one of several obsessive-compulsive spectrum disorders and uses the same diagnostic code, 300.3, that mental health clinicians use to diagnose obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD. The DSM-5 identified the following criteria for diagnosing hoarding disorder, HD. Persistent difficulty discarding or parting with possessions, regardless of their value. Difficulty discarding due to a perceived need to save items and/or distress about discarding them. Accumulation of many possessions that clutter the active living areas of the home, so rooms cannot be used as intended. In some cases, living areas have little clutter because other people intervene, for example, family members, authority figures. Hoarding symptoms cause significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other areas of functioning, including difficulty maintaining a safe environment. Hoarding symptoms are caused by other medical conditions, for example, brain injury, and are not better accounted for by other mental disorders like major depression, obsessive-compulsive disorder, or dementia. In addition, clinicians are asked to specify excessive acquisition when difficulty discarding is accompanied by frequent acquiring. They are also asked to rate insight as good or fair. The person recognizes that the hoarding is problematic. Poor, the person is mostly convinced they don't have a problem. or absent/delusional. The person is completely convinced that their hoarding behavior is not problematic, despite contrary evidence. In addition to the American DSM system for diagnosing mental disorders, many countries use the International Classification of Diseases system, developed by the World Health Organization, version 11, ICD-11, that includes criteria for HD that are very similar to the criteria in DSM-5. But excessive acquisition is considered a basic feature in ICD-11 rather than a specifier. An insight is rated in 2 rather than 3 categories, fair to good or poor to absent. What distinguishes hoarding from other psychiatric and medical problems? Accurately diagnosing HD as distinct from other psychiatric problems requires a careful assessment with special attention to the features of hoarding that are different from other problems. This process is complicated by the high co-occurrence of other primary mental health problems. Common accompanying conditions are discussed in Chapter 2. In addition to asking clients/patients about specific hoarding symptoms, clinicians might consult with experienced colleagues who can help determine the most accurate diagnosis. This is especially important for guiding decisions about empirically supported treatments for hoarding and other accompanying psychiatric problems. Obsessive-compulsive disorder. Hoarding has a number of features that overlap with OCD. These include indecisiveness, perfectionism, checking, and doubting. It is not uncommon for people who are diagnosed with OCD to indicate during a clinical assessment that they also have hoarding symptoms. However, the reverse is not true. Those with HD are less likely to also experience OCD symptoms like obsessions, checking, washing, and ordering. Furthermore, hoarding symptoms such as difficulty discarding and intentional saving are not strongly related to OCD symptoms and tend not to respond well to the psychotherapy and medication treatments that provide relief from OCD symptoms. This difference in treatment effectiveness reinforces the notion that the psychological and biological underpinnings of hoarding are different from OCD. In summary, it may be helpful to remember that although some people diagnosed with OCD have hoarding symptoms, and some people with hoarding report features of OCD, OCD is neither an indication nor a symptom of hoarding. Depression. In a study of people who met the criteria for a primary diagnosis of HD, Drs. Frost, Steketee, and Tolan found that over 50% of people with HD also met diagnostic criteria for major depressive disorder, which is characterized by low energy, poor self-care, changes in eating or sleeping patterns, and general disinterest in previously engaging aspects of life. When thinking about the relationship of hoarding and depression, the age-old chicken or egg question comes to mind. Although it is entirely possible that these two disorders are both present and are not related to each other, clinicians who listen carefully during a clinical interview can determine which one started first. If the symptoms of hoarding began before the symptoms of depression, the person is likely to meet criteria for a primary diagnosis of HD, and depression may be a secondary reaction to the debilitation caused by the hoarding or other psychiatric problems. If so, depression is likely to recede after effective treatment of hoarding. The reverse is also true. If the person had symptoms of depression prior to hoarding symptoms, a diagnosis of major depression is appropriate, and it is less likely that depressive symptoms will resolve after effective treatment for hoarding. Eating disorders. Hoarding of food sometimes occurs among people who have eating disorder symptoms, such as anorexia and bulimia. However, such behaviors would not qualify for a diagnosis of HD unless other types of items are also saved. Psychosis. Schizophrenia is a psychiatric disorder that is characterized by serious distortions in a person's perceptions, thoughts, and behaviors. These distortions include hallucinations and delusions, positive symptoms, and social withdrawal, a negative symptom. Both types of schizophrenia symptoms can be associated with hoarding. Those with positive symptoms of schizophrenia often explain their hoarding behavior as motivated by delusional beliefs. For example, empty takeout food containers might be saved as protection from alien invaders. Excessive saving may also be motivated by negative schizophrenia symptoms when the person feels unmotivated to attend to the accumulating mass of possessions precipitated by their emotional disconnection to the world around them. In such cases, the person with schizophrenia may be unaffected by the removal of items from the home. Such motivations for saving are not consistent with HD as a primary diagnosis, since emotional attachments are not the primary reasons for saving items, and the loss of saved items is not distressing. However, it is possible for a person to suffer from both schizophrenia and HD when both types of symptoms are present. Dementia. Recent studies estimate that between 15% and 49% of people diagnosed with dementia have hoarding behaviors. That's a wide range that requires further understanding. Interestingly, people who hoard, both those with and without dementia, save similar types of items: clothing, paper, household objects. And when asked why they saved the items, dementia sufferers with problematic hoarding provided the same rationale for retaining items as people who hoard and do not have dementia. Clinicians who listen carefully can discern whether cognitive decline is evident when defending their reasons for saving to others. Commonly, people diagnosed with dementia and hoarding will agree to let go of an item, but later forget their decision, sometimes accusing others of stealing the very item they had agreed to discard. Tests of cognitive function, especially in older adults, can help distinguish hoarding as a primary diagnosis from hoarding secondary to dementia. Brain injury. In a series of case studies of people who experience brain damage, symptoms of hoarding appeared alongside other changes in personality and functioning following the brain injury. Specifically, the anterior ventral medial prefrontal cortex, brain region, frontal lobe, bottom of cerebral hemisphere, and cingulate cortex, brain region, middle portion of cerebral hemisphere, were the two most commonly affected regions. Collecting unusual items, difficulty making decisions, and poor judgment resulted. Recent research using magnetic resonance imaging, MRI, revealed that individuals with hoarding symptoms had damage to the mesial-frontal region of the brain just behind the forehead. If excessive collecting and saving behaviors began after an injury to these regions of the brain, a person is likely to have hoarding behaviors as a result of the brain damage, rather than HD as a primary mental illness. Is hoarding of animals part of hoarding disorder? Dr. Gary Petronik formally defined animal hoarding as the accumulation of many animals without providing minimal standards of nutrition, sanitation, and veterinary care. In animal hoarding cases, scores to hundreds of animals are kept in overcrowded and unsanitary environments and are in poor health, showing evidence of disease, starvation, and sometimes death. It is not merely the number of animals that determines whether animal hoarding is present. Certainly, animal breeders and trainers may own or care for large numbers of animals that receive good care and live in healthy environments. In most cases, animal hoarding owners lack insight, denying that they have a problem caring for their animals despite clear evidence to the contrary. They show limited awareness of the harm they cause their animals, often declaring that an obviously sick animal was perfectly healthy, or that the animal enclosure was safe, even when the conditions were filthy. Many people who hoard animals see themselves as rescuers with special ability to understand animals. The information in this section is limited because there is no standardized system to track animal hoarding cases, and research that requires personal participation is difficult because those who hoard animals are accused of animal cruelty, a crime that makes them reluctant to volunteer. The frequency of animal hoarding in the population is not known, but information collected from a geographically diverse group of animal shelters suggests that 1 to 3 cases occur per 100,000 people annually. Animal control and humane societies report about 2,000 cases per year in the United States. Thus, this problem is far less common than the hoarding of objects. About 3/4 of people who hoard animals are women, a higher proportion that is commonly seen in object hoarding. Most are middle-aged and older and are not.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?